Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we are taking a close, deeply focused look at one of the absolutely most baffling missing persons cases in the entire history of Ohio. And we're going to keep a strict eye on the verified facts. What we're looking at here is a genuine, real-world, locked-room mystery. For nearly 20 years, the sudden disappearance of Brian Schaffer has completely captivated researchers, law enforcement, and armchair detectives all over the internet. So what we're going to do today is strictly rely on verified source material. We'll walk through exactly what happened, what we actually know for sure, and we'll unpack the stunning new developments that have recently come to light. Let's take our time, slow down, and unpack this entire thing methodically.
So before we get into the timeline, I want you to ask yourself a question. Seriously, just think about this for a moment. How does an impossible disappearance like this actually happen? In our modern era, in a busy public place, completely surrounded by people, and actively being recorded by closed-circuit television cameras, how does a 27-year-old man just evaporate? It doesn't make any sense, right? But that is the foundational question of this entire case. Literally every single theory, every tip that comes in, every late-night rabbit hole you might go down, all of it stems from one simple, terrifying reality. A man walked into a building on camera, and he never walked out.
All right, let's get into Section 1, tracing his final steps. The night of March 31st, 2006.
Before we talk about the mechanics of the disappearance itself, we really have to understand the man at the center of it. Who was Brian Schaffer? Well, he was a 27-year-old, second-year medical student at Ohio State University. On paper, on the surface, he was incredibly successful. He was handsome, smart, and totally on track for a brilliant career in medicine. But if you look a little closer, psychologically and emotionally, Brian was carrying a massive, heavy load that spring. First of all, it was the very end of finals week. Anyone who has been through med school can tell you he was utterly, completely exhausted from cramming and studying. But more importantly than that, he was deeply grieving. Just 3 weeks prior to this exact night, Brian had tragically lost his mother to cancer. In fact, earlier this very evening, he had shared a quiet steakhouse dinner with his father, Randy Schaffer. Both of these men were in deep mourning. So it's absolutely crucial for us to keep Brian's immense stress and emotional vulnerability right at the forefront of our minds as we look at his actions that night.
So let's actually walk through the timeline of the evening. After that emotionally heavy dinner with his dad, Brian insisted that he still wanted to go out. He needed to blow off some steam. So he met up with his friend and former roommate, a guy named Clint Florence. They kicked off their night at a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Now this place was located on the second floor of a complex known as the South Campus Gateway. They have a few drinks there, and from there, the two of them go bar hopping, making their way southward along High Street. Later on in the night, down in the Arena District, they happened to run into Meredith Reed, who was a mutual friend of Clint's. She offered to give the guys a ride, and the three of them decided to hit all the way back up to where the night began, back to the Ugly Tuna Saloona, for just one last drink before closing time. And that brings us to 2 a.m. This is the exact point where the timeline just falls right off a cliff.
Now, the security footage from the Ugly Tuna Saloona, this is the anchor of this entire mystery. The cameras at the complex clearly caught Brian, Clint, and Meredith going up the escalator and entering the bar. We had that on tape. Inside the crowded bar, Brian eventually becomes separated from his friends. Now, a little bit later, the camera catches him again, this time just outside the main doors, lingering and speaking to two young women. And here is the critical moment. The footage unequivocally shows Brian turning around, walking away from the women, and going back into the bar. He goes back inside. Now, at 2 a.m., the bar closes up for the night. The security cameras capture Clint, they capture Meredith, and they capture every single other patron and staff member leaving that establishment. But they never capture Brian Schaffer leaving. Ever. He is, for all intents and purposes, trapped in a literal locked room.
Moving on to Section 2, comparing the exits. The front door versus the employee exit.
So, for years and years, the prevailing internet myth was that the front door was the absolute, unquestioned only exit to this bar. That's just not true. The front door was, however, heavily monitored by very reliable CCTV. We know for an absolute fact he didn't use that door to leave. But look at the second option here, the employee exit. At the back of the bar, there was a set of doors leading into a service hallway which eventually led out to a construction area and out of the building. And the security cameras covering this back hallway area, well, they were highly unreliable. They were set up in a way where they only recorded still images, not continuous video, and crucially, those recordings were periodically overwritten by the system itself. Now, I want to be very clear here. It is super important to note that no one ever reported seeing Brian in that back hallway or in the construction area. Nobody. But logically speaking, this unmonitored back alley route is the main physical vulnerability in our so-called locked room.
All right, Section 3, Fact and Fiction. Debunking 2 decades of rumors.
5,000 plus. Just let that number sink in for a second. Over 5,000. That is the number of individual tips that local authorities have had to sift through in this case over the years. When a mystery like this drags on for nearly 2 decades, the sheer volume of background noise can completely overwhelm the actual signal. People insert themselves into the story. Rumors become facts. And this is exactly why it is absolutely crucial for us to weed out all those internet distractions and focus only on what has been officially corroborated.
So, let's break down the reality of Brian's life at that time. For years, the widely accepted narrative was that Brian was perfectly happy, he loved med school, and he was planning to propose to his girlfriend Alexis on a spring break trip they had planned for that following Monday. Well, it turns out that is false. Recent podcast interviews and deeper research have revealed he actually wasn't planning a proposal at all. Instead, and this is perhaps due to the immense grief and stress he was under, he had recently asked Alexis to just run away with him, just pack up and go. You see, he was a medical student, sure, but his true burning passion was playing the guitar. He actively dreamed of abandoning the pressure of his current life for a laid-back, Jimmy Buffett-style existence living on an island and playing music. Knowing that gives massive, massive weight to the walk-away theory, doesn't it? Furthermore, private investigator Don Corbett, who worked tirelessly on behalf of the Schaffer family, revealed a stunning detail. Brian's friend Clint Florence, the guy he was with that night, actively refused police requests to take a polygraph test shortly after the disappearance, and he continued to refuse them years later.
Let's look at Section 4, the digital breadcrumbs, triangulating the cell phone data.
Now, this is a fascinating, newly revealed detail from our source material. We often think of cell phones in these older cases as just going completely dead the moment the person goes missing. But in Brian's case, for a full month after he vanished, his mobile phone provider, which was Singular back then, was quietly using triangulation to track his phone's location. Now, to be fair, this wasn't modern GPS pinpointing, it was cell tower pings. But the phone pinged successively across the Columbus area, it pinged from North High Street, then over to the intersection of Kenny and Lane, and it even pinged way out to the suburb of Hilliard. And while cell tower triangulation isn't exact enough to tell you exactly which room a phone is in, detectives were able to use this data, combine it with other intelligence they had gathered, and match it directly to the residential address of a very specific person of interest living near Lane Avenue.
Because of that compelling cell phone data and the specific address match, the police severely escalated their response. They went to a judge and actually obtained a search warrant to enter this suspect's home. And once they were inside, they found something highly, highly suspicious. Down in the basement, they found a large patch of recently disturbed dirt on the floor. I mean, just imagine the tension in that basement. Detectives literally bring in shovels, fully expecting to unearth a body, and finally close the most notorious cold case in Columbus history. They dig deep into the dirt, only to suffer a massive, crushing disappointment. All they found buried down there was an obsolete fuel oil tank that had been used years and years earlier to heat the home. The digital breadcrumbs had ultimately led them to a dead end. Well, at least, that's how it seemed at the time.
Which brings us to Section 5, 20 years later, the 2026 breakthrough. Earlier in 2026, the Columbus-based podcast True Crime Garage aired an exhaustive, deeply researched 6-part retrospective on Brian's case. They collaborated heavily with a very tenacious researcher named Kelly Bruce. Following that massive broadcast, as you can imagine, the show's tip inbox just lit up. And mostly, it was usual noise, people with wild theories, psychics, you name it. But one tip among the pile was entirely different. An anonymous listener texted Kelly Bruce a highly specific tip. And this tip wasn't just a vague feeling. It included precise timeline references, a specific suspect's name, and details that perfectly align with holdback information. Now, holdback information is data that the podcasters and the police had deliberately kept completely hidden from the public, specifically so they could verify if a legitimate lead ever came in. And this tipster knew it.
Realizing what she had, Kelly Bruce immediately took this highly specific name straight to a Columbus Division of Police, and the reaction she got was telling. When she handed the name over, the stunned detective on the other end of the line paused and simply replied, "Holy hell, how do you know that name?"
Now, why was that detective so shocked? He was shocked because the name provided by the anonymous podcast listener in 2026 matched the exact same name of a secret suspect that had been given to police by a friend of Brian's way back in 2006, right after he vanished. Think about the statistical improbability of that. 2 independent tipsters, completely separated by 2 decades of time, pointing their fingers at the exact same publicly unknown person of interest. The gravity of this realization has completely shifted the landscape of the investigation. In fact, it's so significant that following this revelation, Columbus Police Chief Elaine Bryant issued a direct order locking down the department.
She has expressly forbidden the Missing Persons Unit from discussing the Brian Schaffer case with the media or the public in any capacity. They are now operating strictly behind closed doors.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer today. But it leaves us with a truly chilling realization to ponder. If a secret suspect has been quietly corroborated 20 entire years later, what other hidden truths are waiting to be unearthed? If the legendary locked room wasn't actually truly locked, and the supposedly happy medical student was secretly begging his girlfriend to run away with him, what else do we have wrong about that night? The case of Brian Schaffer is no longer just a local ghost story, it is a highly active, breathing investigation once again. I want to thank you all for joining me for this focused look at the facts of this incredible case. Until next time, keep analyzing, keep questioning, and keep learning.